Welcome to Turn the Page, the official podcast of the Syosset Public Library.
Hello, and welcome to another episode of Turn the Page, the official podcast of Syosset Public Library. I'm Jenn, one of your hosts, and today I'm here with a really interesting author who happens to be an old college friend. Hello, friend.
Hello.
Could I ask you to introduce yourself and your book?
Yes. My name is Austin Trunick. I am a film historian and the author of the Canon Film Guide, a series of books about the films produced by the film company Canon under Golden Globus, mostly throughout the 1980s and into the early 90s.
Nice. So I'd love for you to start us off by talking a little bit about your film writing and your career and how it led you to, undertaking this series.
Well, I had been writing about film for various outlets for years before this. And I needed a project that I could focus on my own. My mind went back to Canon. Canon is the company that made a lot of the action movies, especially the low budget B action movies, ninja films, Chuck Norris films, Charles Bronson movies that I grew up watching, probably way too young, at first with my dad and then with my buddies at our very lenient VHS rental shop. And thinking back, that's really the era, that's where I grew, that's where I fell in love with film, is through watching these cheesy movies, and my tastes greatly expanded, and I learned about all sorts of movies as I grew up, and especially going to learn about film at NYU. But Canon kept coming back to me. They were this company that in my childhood, I would go to the rental shop looking at the VHS tapes, and they always had these big, splashy, fancy covers with titles like Revenge of the Ninja or Invasion USA, and incredible artwork. And they were a company that was very good at selling you on a movie of questionable quality with that really fancy, beautiful, flashy artwork and taglines and things like that. So my mind just kept drifting back to them. And as I learned more about these movies and the company that made them, I learned that the stories behind a lot of these movies are as crazy as the films, as what we see on screen, if not crazier, because this is a company that produced in-house almost 200 films over the course of 14 years, which is a wild amount. At their height, in the mid 80s, they were producing 40 to 60 movies a year, which your average studio, if they produced 6 or 7 movies, that was a very busy year for them.
Yeah, that's like inconceivable. Where they get the time?
Yeah, and then that's part of what inspired me. I wanted to find out how they did it and why, like how were they capable of producing Charles Bronson, Chuck Norris, Michael Dudikoff, and Sylvester Stallone movies all in one year, along with movies by Godard and Franco Zeffirelli and Robert Altman and all these big names all at the same time in a period of that's just a 12-month stretch. It's wild to try to wrap my head around this stuff. And that's where it began. It snowballed from being a project I originally just wanted to write about my 50 favorite Canon movies and be a nice little short and sweet book, to something that has grown to 3 volumes, and the second volume, which just came out, is over 1,000 pages. So we're probably looking at over 2,500 pages by the time this is all said and done about one specific company's work, which I'm stunned that I've gotten this far.
Yeah, it's kind of amazing. It's incredibly comprehensive. And very engaging too. And it's written in such a way that it does present an overarching narrative that's super complex about the history of this company, but also it's very anecdotal, about with stories about the making of individual movies and the whims and decisions of various actors in the Canon film group. And, I'm very interested. And, before we get into the second book, I was hoping we could talk a little bit about like the early history and like the context for what you present in the second book. They were, as you said, like the most prolific B movie studio of the 80s, but their early output is really variegated and very, like kind of not all over the place, but just really expansive and eclectic. And I'm wondering if you could walk us through a little bit their early history and sort of how they arrived at this status of like an A grade B movie factory,
Yes. Well, looking at the history of Canon, you're really looking at the two characters, the two men who led this company, Menachem Golan and Yoram Globus, the two Israeli cousins who, prior to their acquisition of Canon, were the most successful producers in Israel. They really did a lot to build the Israeli film industry. And they've been doing that for about 16 years at that point, making films, a lot of Hebrew musicals and comedies and dramas. A few of their films were nominated for the Best Foreign Language Feature before this, and just very financially successful. But the one market they never really penetrated was the US. And they wanted to make Hollywood movies. They made English language movies, but they just never really gained any traction here. But these two cousins, Golan and Globus, they had wanted to, Hollywood was their dream. That's where they wanted to go. That's what inspired them to get into movies, watching these MGM musicals and the John Wayne movies and things, and in theaters in Israel on military bases. But how they finally thought they would go about this is, rather than continue to make their movies internationally and sell them to the US to be distributed, they used some of the money that they got from all these other successes to buy basically a failing American film company called Canon, which is a New York-based company that they had some successful independent features, but at that point they were best known really for taking Eastern European and Northern European pornographic films and redubbing them, subtitling them, and sending them to grindhouse theaters, to 42nd Street and drive-ins and things like that. But they had pretty much were about to fold, and Canon came in. Golan Globus came in and bought Canon, and that's where they started making their movies in Hollywood. But they already had a bit of a distribution chain in place at that point. They had these sort of small theaters, and they started out making exploitation films, those same sort of a few slashers, some sex comedies and things like that they knew they could sell easily into US theaters. But as they went on, they also tried to branch out a bit. They made some of their very early films. One of them is an adaptation of Lady Chatterley's Lover, starring Sylvia Christel, who was known, this erotic actress, very famous for the Emmanuelle series.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so they would branch out to things like that. But what really kind of set their course was Death Wish 2. Mm-hmm. It was a film that they had announced, really one of the first things when they bought the company. They took out big giant trade ads in Variety and Hollywood Reporter and announcing their first 10 movies that they're going to produce at Canon. And many of these they didn't produce, and many of these they didn't even have the rights to make. And Death Wish was one of those. They announced a sequel to Death Wish. And they did not have the film rights to Death Wish, and most of the people involved with the first Death Wish movie were not aware that this was going to be announced until they saw it in the papers. Oh. So this was the story behind Death Wish 2. Is Dino De Laurentiis, who had the rights to the initial Death Wish, 1974, which was 6 years ago at this point, saw the ad, said, "There's no way anyone's going to make this movie. Who wants to see us? Like, Death Wish doesn't need a sequel. It's been 6 years, and Charles Bronson never going to do it." So he has his lawyers call up the new Canon leaders and basically strong arm them into buying the rights to Death Wish. Thinking that the film's never going to get made. He doesn't make that. It's no use to him. So they ended up buying it for 6-figure sum. And at that point, they're stuck. And so they just have to keep making higher and higher offers to Charles Bronson until he can't refuse. He ended up making $1.5 million to make a Death Wish 2. But to everyone's surprise, the movie was a huge hit. And suddenly people could take Canon seriously. It was successful all across the world, and in the US especially. On video, it was a new market, and cable. Both of those were growing right at the time that Canon came in, and they really jumped on them very well. But it also set them on that sort of course on making more and more action movies. That became their bread and butter because people associated them with the Death Wish franchise. And then after that, the Missing in Action franchise with Chuck Norris, and the Ninja films, which were also a big success for them with Enter the Ninja and the American Ninja franchise later on. But they were very, as you said, very eclectic. They made movies for every shelf in the video store. You have your biblical sci-fi musical, like dystopian sci-fi disco musical, The Apple, which is a wild early film, to many erotic dramas based on literature, to comedies like The Last American Virgin, to, again, Death Wish and Enter the Ninja, and especially when you get into the Vietnam action movies, they were very big into making those. But it was all over the place because they were just throwing thousands of ideas at the wall, and whatever stuck they would make.
That is so interesting, and it's sort of like, it dovetails really nicely with this other book I'm reading right now. I'm reading Keith Phipps' book about Nicolas Cage. And he talks broadly about changes in the film industry over this period, like the 70s into the 80s, and how the industry as a whole was moving away from these like smaller scale, riskier, like independent realist type movies into like more blockbustery type, big action movies with stars and like lots of spectacle. And you could kind of see that happening like when you flip through Canon's catalog too, because in the 70s, in addition to like Death Wish, you have like Joe with Peter Boyle, which was like Oscar nominated, and you have Street Smart, right, with like Morgan Freeman, and that was his first Oscar nomination too. But like you do see this sort of like shift with Golan and Globus, and it really coincides almost perfectly with like the period of time that your first book covers, the 1980 to 84, right? And let's talk a little bit about your sources, because they're really fascinating. It's meticulously researched, and you have lots of really great interviews, photos, and behind the scene documents. And I'm wondering, like, how did you get access to these things and these people? And, what is it like tracking down these people who were like in a movie that you're talking about 40 years ago, but who have gone on to do like vastly different things, and I'm wondering like what that was like to talk to people about something that they had done so long ago,
Well, as far as the text resources, the libraries have been my my friend throughout this whole process. Especially the Performing Arts Library in Lincoln Center is a place where I spent many days and many hours going through trade magazines and issues of Variety and Screen International and anything I could any text I could find that had mentions of any of their films. And then the interviews are the biggest, my main source of research here. And it's tricky because a lot of these people are retired, or they made a few movies and left the business, and they sell real estate now, or they're teachers or sculptors. And it is interesting that a lot of these people have gone on to very interesting second careers since this very short stint in the movie business back then. But in terms of finding them, the most valuable way has just been one person knows another person knows another person. So I'll interview a director of a movie, and he still keeps in touch with all of these people, and he suggests, why don't you call them? Or like, I'll send them your info, or I'll send them send them a text. And that's been a lot of it. And that's a good reason why the second book is so much larger than the first one, so many of the people who I had reached out to initially while writing my first book there's no reason for me. I'm just a guy who's saying I'm doing something at that point. But when the first book was out there and I could point to that and the press it got, and just an Amazon page is something that's very convincing. People saw that, and suddenly I was getting more responses to the emails, which was wonderful. I've got some people that I never imagined I would talk to, which is fun. But that's, again, is another reason why this whole project, I love it, because I can talk to the people who made the movies that a lot of these movies I have loved since I was 6 years old and watching an R-rated movie that my dad brought home.
That's super cool. Yeah, it must be really interesting to talk to all these people who I imagine also have like a variety of like feelings about the movies that they were in. Like, did you find that people had a lot of different variegated feelings about having been involved with Canon, or do people recall it fondly or not so fondly, or what did you find?
There's a very wide range. It is a company that, because of the way they worked, it was very hectic at times. If you're juggling a lot of films, there were a lot of cases where I would say 95% of them, the somebody else at Canon got to do the final edit rather than the director. So a lot of things where there are hard feelings, or actors that were promised roles and then replaced by the time they were ready to show up on set. It's a mix. There are people whose careers started there, or the entirety of their careers with Canon, and look on it very fondly. These are their young people, especially 20s and early 30s, where they learned all they know about film. They learned that was their film school almost. But then you do get people who, not as many that are interested in the book, because a lot are interviewed in the book, because a lot of the people who had really bad experiences didn't want to talk about it, and I respected that. And there were people who supplied stories off the record who are in the stories are in there, but they didn't want to be identified. But a lot of times they'll respectfully decline. So I appreciate that. If I don't want to scratch at a scab or something, if this was a really tough time in your career. And for some people it was. You get people who loved it, and then you have people who really kind of want to bury those years.
Yeah, that makes a ton of sense. I'm wondering in particular, like, who were some of your most interesting or most engaging interview subjects? Like, who did you learn unexpected things from? Who was really forthcoming? Like, who was super memorable?
There's a lot of those. Sam Furstenberg is one of my favorite people in the world now at this point. But he's a director. He directed Revenge of the Ninja, Ninja 3, The Domination, Breakin' 2, Electric Boogaloo, American Ninja, Avenging Force. This just great run of B action films, and with one break dance and musical in the middle there. But he's a guy who really thrived at Canon because he was young. He wanted to make movies, and he knew how to squeeze out so much production value out of a budget, and how to find people who were very talented to work with him and let them do their thing. So he's someone who just wonderful stories, but is also keenly aware of that he was making B movies, and he just had a lot of fun doing it. He's always a fun person. I've interviewed him a lot for these books, and he's super, super nice and super generous with the stories he shares. But people who, Luigi Cozzi is somebody who was very interesting to me, who directed a few movies for Canon, but he worked very closely with Dario Argento through the 70s and 80s. So he's somebody who knew all these different Italian directors and had worked with them in various ways and had great stories. But just some people I also just never expected to talk to. Wings Hauser is someone I interview in the second book, who just one of my favorite B movie actors, and it was one of the wildest, funniest conversations I've ever had, because he just casually drops a story about meeting Charles Manson as a kid there. He tells a story about Bob Denver was his neighbor from Gilligan's Island, and about how he had a cheetah run like outside of his house, and he had a chimpanzee that would chase his sisters around. And it's the most nutty, all over the place conversation. And Michael Dudikoff, somebody who I never expected, because he was one of Canon's bigger stars of the second like half of their run, and he agreed to do the interview, and is wound up being one of the most well-adjusted. He's just an all-around good guy, and has just a great view of the world. Someone I really admire, because you look at a lot of 80s action stars and they've gone through a lot, and they've let the fame go to their head, or gotten into drugs or money problems and things like that. But he didn't. He's just really grateful he got to make all these movies, and just, yeah, so there's a lot of fun stuff. But yeah, just I try to talk to people from all over the filmmaking process. So some of the ones I enjoyed are the who can talk about the sides that I don't know about. There's effects guys, for one thing, or stuntmen. Stuntmen are another fun. They're fun people to talk to, because you can ask them in the movies, did it hurt when you did this? Did that hurt? Or like, where did you break? Like, and they'll list the injuries. They'll talk about all the things they did on these films where there were really no budgets. And but yeah, it's all of it. I've had a good time talking to a lot of different people.
That's very cool. When you talk to people like Wings Hauser or Michael Dudikoff, like, do you need to sort of like compartmentalize like Austin Trunick the fan from Austin Trunick the researcher, or do you just kind of let them like blend? Or do you like, are you aware? Because I find it very difficult sometimes when I'm interviewing an author that I really admire, to sort of keep the fandom like glee out of it, or at least to let in like an appropriate amount of it, like 5 to 10%. Like, is that something that you are mindful of when you're interviewing folks? Or
yes, I have to really, really prepare. I go to the lengths of even just jotting down lines for a script if I need to jump to it, so I can bury the fan side of myself down as deep as I can, and be as professional as possible. But that doesn't mean as soon as the conversation's over, as soon as I hang up the phone, that I'm not like running upstairs just screaming to my wife like, oh my God, who did I just talk to? You wouldn't believe it. So yeah, it's tough though. It's very tough. But again, so many of these, everyone I've spoken to has been so down to earth, which is great. There haven't been any, I haven't had to deal with any egos, which is impressive, considering the number of people I've spoken to, and the conversations I've had in interviews for, not for this book, but for magazines and articles that I've written. I've encountered that some people that it's tough to talk to them in a way that is both casual and professional.
Yeah, for sure. Speaking of, fandom and nerding out, your first book got a really great blurb from Frank Conniff, who is like one of my childhood heroes because of Mystery Science Theater 3000. And, I don't often talk to authors about like blurbs and pull quotes, but like, what was that like? Because I know that you were also like super into it. So like, was that like a huge mind blow moment, or?
It was getting an endorsement from TV's Frank was incredible for me. But he's a New Yorker. He actually, I was living in Astoria for years and years, and he was doing a monthly show at a comedy club there called QED, and it was he'd invite comedians to come on with him, and they would watch some basically very weird, obscure cartoons, a lot of forgotten 70s and 80s or foreign imports and things like that. And they would riff them, but it was also framed as if it were this like forgotten children's variety shows. They would do it in costume and things like that. So I had gone to that a few times and met him through there, and then had interviewed him about Mystery Science Theater, and when he was doing a podcast. Now he's doing it as a show called The Mads with Trace, who played Dr. Forrester on the show. Mm-hmm. But yeah, it was one of those things where I reached out not expecting to hear back. I know obviously Mystery Science Theory's got an association with B movies from that show, but through the various podcasts he's done, things he's written, and if you follow him on social media, he's a huge movie buff, and knows a lot about movies that are not bad or B movies at all. He can talk, I wish he would host a show on TCM or something like that. But I reached out, and yeah, he was game. He wanted to take a look at the book, and that was a moment. I've interviewed people for the book and people I admire, but I was scared, like opening up my emails from him, because I am such a such a Mystery Science Theater fan.
Yeah, it must be really surreal. And it's very cool to, I feel like it's all kind of part of like this point that I've been trying to figure out how to make, is that like these like film buffs like Frank and like you, like there is, even though like the history of Canon film is like really, up and down and very rocky in places. And like, there's a lot of like just joy at movies like that are present in the book, and also like just in among like the fans, like, and one of the things that I love about the book is that like it's spawned this like really kind of cool online community, like because you have your Canon film like Facebook posts and your Twitter presence, and I just always see like these really enthusiastic comments like on all of your posts about stuff, and like there's just like a lot of like just joy and love of movies like driving the whole thing. And it's cool that like the people who you've had read the book to comment on it seem to be kind of driven by the same things,
Oh, thank you. It's there's a tone that's I don't want to make fun of movies as much as I enjoy even something like Mystery Science Theater 3000. You can tell that even though they're making jokes at the movie's expense, that all of those guys, everyone who worked on that show, loved movies.
Yeah.
And Canon is something that, even though they are associated with a lot of cheesy movies or bad movies, they're entertaining. Even if a movie is cheesy, if you're entertained by it, it succeeds at what what a movie should do. So yeah, that's just, I think that something I was trying to stay away from is, I don't want to attack these films. I enjoy them. I know people worked hard on them, lots of people, and very few people, I should say, set out to make a bad movie. If a movie is bad, it's usually for interesting reasons, not because that's what they wanted to do. So I do my best to respect that. And even if there are movies that, and there are quite a few that I've covered that aren't good by any stretch of the imagination, I want to try to respect the process that went into it and try to find out what went wrong here. Where did you run out of money? Where did you have actors quit in the middle of the movie and have to keep shooting without those characters all of a sudden? Things like that. And again, a lot of these movies that had really kind of terrible final results have completely fascinating stories as to explain why they came out that way.
I think you can see that too in a lot of movies, like commentary tracks, and a lot of people like filmmaking documentaries. And it's often a lot more fun to talk about movie making failures or challenges than it is to talk about successes. I'm thinking like the documentaries about like Apocalypse Now, or like the making of The Island Dr. Moreau.
Mhm.
You know, like so many more interesting things seem to happen on movies that don't, you know, that aren't the best. And I think that's really interesting. Before we wrap up, let's introduce our listeners to Volume 2, because it is, as you said, it's a huge volume, and it only covers 2 years, 85 to 87, which, you know, tells us off the bat that that is probably like Canon's most prolific period. And in that period, they have their most prolific year. Is that correct?
Yes, that was really the Canon's peak. They hit a point where they were successful enough at what they were doing that they could greatly expand the number of movies they were making each year. They very famously took out a 60 full page ads in Variety for Cannes in 1986, advertising the movies they were going to make for that following year. So 60 movies, do the math, there's 52 weeks in a year. They didn't end up making all of them, but it's just crazy that that is where they thought they were at and what they could do. And they also had more money because of the success. People, larger lines of credit, people had good faith in what they were doing, that they were increasing the budgets. So rather than making a bunch of $5 million Chuck Norris and ninja movies, they were financing, you know, $24 million Life Force, Tobe Hooper's like space vampires, wild science fiction extravaganza. Over the Top with Sylvester Stallone was a movie that, for a very brief period of time, made Sylvester Stallone the highest paid actor in Hollywood. And they had to make him that because he didn't want to work with Canon. And so unless he broke records, they weren't going to take him. He wasn't going to do business with them. And then movies like Master Universe and Superman 4, which were supposed to have huge budgets, but because of all these other bad decisions that they made when they went to actually shoot these films, they only had really half the budget they needed to make the movie. And you can see that. You can see those results on screen, especially with something like Superman 4, which looks much worse than the 3 movies that came before it.
It really does. Yeah, that's so interesting that you do have just the sheer volume of output, and having some things that were, you know, so high profile too, because like, even if it was really bad, like getting an installment in a Superman franchise is like a big deal, you know? Did they also do Cobra?
So they had production credits on, producers credits on Cobra. Cobra was a Warner Brothers movie, and the very short story, I get into this in the book in much more detail, but they had this exclusive contract with Stallone, $12 million. His next movie was going to be with Canon, but Canon didn't have that sort of money to actually make the movie after they had signed this deal with Stallone. So they drummed up as much as they could through product placement and sales, but they still didn't have enough. So finally, Warner Brothers stepped in, and they had said, essentially, like, we want all of these future films, the distribution rights you're doing, we will back you, we'll pay for the rest, we'll help you with Over the Top, we'll distribute it and give you the rest of the budget you need. But you also have to wait another 8 months to shoot Over the Top, push your schedule back, and let us shoot Cobra, because they wanted to make Cobra. And it was basically a way to get Stallone out of his exclusive contract and to save face, because they'd been advertising for almost 2 years that they had the exclusive with Stallone. They ended up getting a vanity credit on Cobra.
I see. Okay. Very interesting. Yeah, because I think that is like the first Canon related film I've seen, and I've seen a lot more since then. But it is like I don't know, it's really indicative, I think, with like the ninja movies as well, of the way that they were like both hopping on trends and sort of like pushing them as well, you know, because they are kind of responsible for that, like that 80s ninja phenomenon, you know.
Yes, yeah, ninjas were one of the examples where it was a trend that Canon was really ahead of the whole ninja phenomenon. Before that, in Western movies, you might have a ninja as a minor villain in a Bond movie, or The Octagon with Chuck Norris, where he fights a couple people in ninja costumes. But Canon was the first company to, with Enter the Ninja, take a ninja and put them at the center of the movie. And a lot of that came from a martial artist named Mike Stone, who had basically brought this idea of like, ninjas are awesome, we need to make ninja movies, to Canon. And then Sho Kosugi, who was, he starred in their first 3 ninja movies, but in the first movie he plays a villain. But he wanted an aspiring actor, martial artist, but also knew a lot about ninja history and really kind of a scholar in that sense. But he brought a lot of his martial arts, his weapons and toys with him on the shoot, and was kind of a consultant as well as an actor and a choreographer, and playing most of the ninjas that Franco Nero fights in that film. But what's funny is, after that movie, and that movie was it was a big hit, but so influential that a lot of the things that Sho Kosugi brought to Enter the Ninja became part of the ninjas we see in pop culture. I think of like Michelangelo has nunchucks in Ninja Turtles, and that is not a weapon that historically ninjas would have had any use for. But Menachem Golan, who was the head of Canon, also directed Enter the Ninja, had seen Enter the Dragon, of course, Enter the Dragon, Enter the Ninja, saw the nunchucks in there, and was like, you need to put nunchucks in the movie. And Sho Kosugi argued against it, but the director won out, and he has a little play. He plays with some nunchucks at different parts in that movie, and that became part of the ninja that we see in pop culture. They have nunchucks. They have all the weapons that he uses in that movie weren't traditional weapons. These are things that Sho Kosugi himself and ended up being used in everything else. There's a great website run by Keith Rainville. It's called Vintage Ninja. And he has, if you want to know anything about ninjas and pop culture, that's a good place to go. But he has a great section on the site where it's all of these different comic book covers, video game covers, other videos and things like that, where it's artists drawing ninjas, but they're just looking at basically in photos of Sho Kosugi from those movies and drawing the exact same poses and things like that. There's even Frank Miller, who was putting ninjas in Daredevil back then. You could tell that he had looked at Enter the Ninja, and that's where some of these things would come from, which is just wild. But then after the movie was a hit, they were pumping out ninja movies nonstop, and it exploded from there. I remember my childhood, and there wasn't a single cartoon which didn't have a ninja bad guy of some sort. And Canon was very, very much responsible for really making that craze go as wide as it did.
Yeah, that is so fascinating. It's wild how much a movie or something, a fictional detail like that can just become part of the canon.
Yes.
And just like shape the way that we see these historical phenomenon. It's really interesting. All right, so right before we wrap up, let's look forward to book 3, because when book 2 ends in 87, they're sort of like writing the zenith of what they're going to achieve. Can you tell us a little bit of like what we can look forward to in volume 3?
Well, volume 3 is I've been referring to it as the dark years, the direct to video years of Canon. Because when I was talking just a few moments ago about their heights, really the peak they reached in 86 going in 87, it really plateaus very quick and then plummets. It's just this crazy fall. They had this meteoric rise and then just dead weight dropping at that point. And there were a few things. They went from, in I want to say March of 1986, having $300 million in lines of credit to make movies, which should have kept them going for a long time. but they basically blew on real estate and buying up theater chains in the UK, and then a lot of these big flops, but that they had big budget movies that they ran out of money for, and it basically amounted to them. March of 1986, they had $300 million to play with. By August, they were $100 million in debt and being bailed out by companies like Warner Brothers and people who would come in and sort of pick up the pieces on the projects they want in exchange for money. And they also were investigated by the SEC for that point for misreporting both how much they spent on their movies and how much their movies made. So a lot of things went very wrong for them in 1987, and the second book starts to get into that, where these issues are. But by 1988, that's where the whole place starts just taking on water, and they managed to survive for another, until 1994, just bailing water over at the time. But at that point, they couldn't afford to take these risks, take these big chances. They were just really pumping out these low budget action movies and these sequels. The one bright spot for them during that time was basically discovering Jean-Claude Van Damme. Like, they Bloodsport and Cyborg, and those were huge hits, but it really came too late for them really to cash in. By the time Van Damme was a star from the movies he made with them, they could no longer afford his services. But yeah, so there's a lot of direct-to-video, a lot of direct-to-cable movies covered in the third one, which may not be as exciting as the ones that go after, that came before it. But one of the things I'm very excited about in book 3 that I've been working on, and it's kind of the craziest research I've done yet, is a section on about 150 movies right now and counting that Canon announced at some point or advertised but did not make. And I've been interviewing people about movies, basically unmade movies, which is just feels so weird at points. But talking to people, looking at these advertisements, trying to find screenwriters or producers and just talk to them. What went wrong? What would this movie have looked like? And you get some fun stuff. There's very famously the Spider-Man movie. Canon had the rights to Spider-Man and Captain America that they bought from Marvel for $225,000, which is wild. At one point they had both the rights to Superman and Spider-Man, which is crazy to think about in these days.
Gosh.
But Spider-Man went through many rewrites. There's scripts you can find, and I've very different versions with different writers and different directors attached. There's movies. Some that fascinate me is Tobe Hooper's Pinocchio the Robots, which would have been a science fiction retelling of Pinocchio with Lee Marvin playing Geppetto, with a script by Dan O'Bannon, who wrote Alien, which is just a movie that we didn't get, and I am so sad by that. But I've been having a lot of fun trying to find whatever pieces of what this movie would have looked like had we gotten it. So that's a section that I'm very much looking forward to, beyond the close to a few of like Canon's famous franchises and the rise of Van Damme, and of course the story of this whole like beautiful company just burning to the ground. I'm very excited to really get to the bottom of these movies, and a lot of them it's fun because I do have these beautiful, like in some cases large color posters, like mini posters that they made for movies. I have a poster for Godzilla versus Cleveland, which is a movie that they were working on, they were ready to make, but Canon did not realize that somebody probably owns the rights to Godzilla, and they just can't. It's not like Dracula, or it's not a public domain character.
Yeah,
which they learned the hard way very quickly. But it didn't stop them from printing posters and trying to sell this film at the American Film Market and Cannes Film Festival, which is wild.
Oh, that is another little interesting detail that I had wanted to talk about. The way, I mean, they have great posters, A, and B, the way that they would use posters in order to finance their movies
Mhm.
is super interesting. Is that something that they did throughout, or was that like
That,
something they did for a time?
yeah, that was their business model throughout the. Probably 90% of their movies were sold that way. And it wasn't something they came up with first. I mean, you have Sam Markoff with AIP, American International, and Roger Corman, New World did things like this. It wasn't unique to Canon, but Canon was very, very good at it. And they had been doing that. Golden Globes had been doing it in the 70s before they came to Canon. They had success selling their Hebrew, their black and white Hebrew comedies and having them play in Japan, like things like that, that tells you how good they were at it. But Canon, very famously, they would print up these catalogs, or they would take out these large spreads in Variety and Hollywood Reporter. And for the American film market, for the Cannes Film Festival, for the Milan MIFED out in Italy, they would take these there and they would basically have 50 ideas, 60 ideas for movies. And these movies didn't have scripts a lot of the times. They didn't have talent attached. Sometimes they didn't have titles. Sometimes they only had an actor. You'd have a title for Untitled Charles Bronson movie, but they would, a lot of the times when they could, they would make up this amazing art with a tagline before there was a script, before there was talent attached. And they'd sell these to Germany, to Spain, to Italy, to Canada, to Showtime, to the Movie Channel, to HBO, to all the different video labels, MGM, Warner Brothers, Vestron released a few. And basically their model of working is if they had an idea, they would advertise like 3 different Charles Bronson movies in a book. If one had $10 million worth of pre-sales, then they would make the movie for $5 million. And that way they'd already made a profit before the film even went into production. And it didn't matter if, I know a lot of people point at, oh, these movies, like how can they release this movie? And you see box office numbers on Wikipedia and it's like, oh, this movie only made 500 grand in theaters, but Canon made $5 million making that movie. It didn't matter to them if nobody saw it in theaters or if it got ripped apart by critics. That was, the box office was such a small percentage of their business. And yeah, that's that way of sort of pre-selling things, selling things based on ideas, leads to some wild stories. You have where people buy up a Charles Bronson movie that has no script, has no storyline, and they need to write this thing and shoot it and deliver it by November. So you get these movies that come out really fast. Texas Chainsaw Massacre 2 is one that Canon had pre-sold it with an August of 1986 release date. January of 1986 rolls around and Tobe Hooper was only going to produce this, but he couldn't find a director to do it that Canon was willing to pay. So Tobe ends up directing it himself. There's no script. He gets his friend to start writing the script. The movie starts shooting in May of 1986. The final script is dated June 28th, 1986. They wrapped shooting on July 4th, and they were in theaters, I believe, on August 6th.
Oh my gosh.
So it's a movie that from concept to theaters is approximately 6 months. But it was really like written on the spot. It's wild to think that they did that, but Canon had promised this movie to movie theaters, and if they didn't deliver it, they would have to pay back the money that they had already cashed the checks. But it ends up with interesting cases like that, because Texas Chainsaw Massacre 2 is another movie that anybody's seen it, they know it's a very dark comedy. It's very, very goofy, very different from the original film, but Canon had no idea when they were selling it. And you watch all the trailers that they've been showing in theaters. They didn't actually, because the movie hadn't been shot, but they were showing trailers. but the previews are these extremely like dark, the most terrifying like the sequel to the most terrifying film of all time is more terrifying. It's just playing it up as this straight horror movie, and people show up at the theater to see it and get this cannibal comedy. Their way of working produced a lot of very, very wild results like that.
Yeah, it really speaks to their scrappiness, their inventiveness, and this sort of like willingness to fly by the seat of their pants and just kind of like see what happens, which makes it very hard not to root for them, like they're as wild and as bizarre as some of their output is, like there is like a sort of underdog quality to them that makes them like very easy to sort of like root for. Well, I want to thank you so much for coming to talk to me and our listeners. This has been a lot of fun, and I'm hoping that when volume 3 is ready, you'll consider coming back to the show and filling us in on the we've talked about the rise of Canon, and I would love to talk about the fall of Canon with you.
Oh, I would love that. Thank you so much for having me. This has been so much fun.
Oh, you're very welcome. So listeners, if you're interested in film history or action movies or just Chuck Norris, I would absolutely check out this book series. It's now available. Both volumes 1 and 2 are now available. You could check them out at your favorite bookstore or perhaps your favorite library. This has been Jenn in conversation with Austin Trunick. And I would like to thank you for listening. And it is now time to close this chapter.
It's time to close this chapter of Turn the Page. Join us for the next episode.